So next is Thomas Martinez Pilnik. Is a British-Brazilian artist who uses textiles and ceramics to explore death, desire, nostalgia, and memory. Pilnik has exhibited internationally in spaces including Zaratan Contemporary Art in Lisbon, Ethan Cohen Gallery in New York, the Bomb Factory Art Foundation in London, and Lauren Powell Projects in Los Angeles. He has been an artist in residence at Zaratan, at Mackenzie Gibson Studios in Rhode Island, and Stoveworks in Tennessee. Please welcome Thomas Martinez Pilnik.
Hi, everyone. Gotta find my page. There we go. All right. I want to echo Catherine's sentiments in thanking you all for being here. Seeing a room full of people is incredible. I also want to express my gratitude to those who cannot be here anymore. Their work, their presence in my work is what makes it feel alive. Coisa Feia is a phrase that I remember my mom saying sharply as she slapped my hand away from my mouth as I was prolifically biting my nails, a habit I still do to this day and will probably never kick. Immediately after saying that, she would turn to our scraggly little family dog and go, "Ai, que coisa feia," expressing the kind of cute ugliness embedded in that little creature, and a kind of cute aggression that I think we all feel when encountering those kinds of animals. That softness and that sharpness together is kind of what tethers my work in place. But before I get to the work, I'd like to bring you into my own visual landscape through a digital mood board I've been kind of growing over the past few years. Embedded within this landscape, this kind of illustrated encyclopedia of my brain, are images referencing smoking and the habits associated, biting my nails, of course, drawing blood, scars on my skin from battles with skin cancer, food I remember from both Brazil and the UK, song lyrics from artists I love like Self-Esteem and Sophie, iconography from the Catholic Church, from my own queerness, and everything in between in terms of sexual liberation, risk-taking, gambling, board games, and all of that. And all of that imagery leads into my own work and my own ways of thinking. I make work that thinks about our universal absolute. I never mention it in my statement. I very rarely direct it head on, but I'll tell you now that that universal absolute is death. And I landed on that thinking about, as my grandma was passing away a few years ago, the imagery of her hands, how scared I was of them when they came near me to touch me, how they aged, how they creased, how they darkened, how they faded away, until they were no longer present, and her physical reality was replaced by the memories we have of her. And so I started to think about all of that and started to really want my own voice and my own nostalgia and my own memories to be really present in the work. So not only was I thinking through all of that, but I was waking up at odd hours of the morning and opening my notes app on my phone and coming up with my own imagery, taking all of that landscape, all of those words, all of those lyrics, and frantically and hurriedly jotting them down so that I could then go to the studio and create from my own imagery. While I was thinking about all of that, I was also looking at a lot of work myself. My eye always gravitated to contemporary ceramicists. It has for a really long time. And recently I've really started to kind of understand why that is. The four here start with Stephanie Shi. Her diasporic ceramic creations associated with products she remembers of the Asian diaspora and Jewish diaspora in New York are always just like such profound messages of memory and nostalgia to me. Moving down to Lindsay Mendick, she's a British artist that always seems to prioritize pleasure. She thinks about liberation in a way that feels profound and powerful, especially in an academicized art world that can often feel a little stifling. Moving across to Kathy Butterly, the kind of gloopiness and heaviness of her surface treatments that feel so fun, whimsical, and also serious have always spoken to me. And then up to Theasta Gates, who somehow always makes me cry through the simplest of gestures. The way he can make a pot so laden of emotions feels really, really important to the way that I want to make my work. And so considering all of that, I go back to Coisa, Feia, defined literally as, what an ugly thing. It can be said sharply, it can be said softly, and it's a phrase that's followed me throughout my life and felt especially resonant when I was doing my residency in Zaratan in Lisbon, Portugal in the summer of 2021. Lisbon being one of the most walkable cities in the world, and especially in Europe, I was always walking around seeking the imagery and inspiration that I was looking for during a month-long residency where I was offered an opportunity to come up with a kind of capstone project at the end in this like cavernous music auditorium space that they had. And as I was walking around, I was noticing A, a lot of trash on the ground, and B, a lot of like pop-up concept luxury boutiques. And so I wanted to use that visual language, use those walks for my own. And at the time, I'll be the first to admit, was making kind of overly academicized works. I was taking myself very seriously, I was taking the work very seriously, and I think I was losing myself. But I think talking about this project is important, not only for its coding capabilities, but also the way that I started to present my own hand in the work. I took junk mail that was delivered to the gallery over the course of the month and painstakingly paper-mache'd over each piece of trash that I collected. I archived each piece of trash, depending on the neighborhood that I picked it up from, and created this store pricing the pieces based on the property values of the neighborhood that I found them in. This kind of critique on capitalism is something I'm still really interested in, but in describing the work, I find that I'm not really talking about myself or my presence. And that was something that I think a lot of the professors and other people that I was speaking to here at UConn were also feeling. And so when I returned to UConn in the fall of 2021, I had an opportunity to take this idea and kind of explode it out. And so I created Your Local Package Store. And so here, I wasn't collecting other people's trash, I was hoarding my own. The collection practice was driving myself from liquor store to liquor store, collecting boxes into which I would display the trash. I then dipped my own trash in plaster, and as a way to connect myself back into the work, engraved a story or a sentence into every single piece of trash. The most important one, and it's hard to read, but it's "This cup of Coke got me through a panic attack." It was the first time I had just told the truth in my work about myself. It felt important, it felt necessary, and it allowed me to express a vulnerability that I don't think I had expressed in my work before. And I think that's when everything really changed. I started thinking about my hands, and in the spring of 2022, I was taking a mold making class with Professor Bach in the ceramics building. There I used plaster molds that I made to create ceramic slip casts of objects. I only managed to make one that semester. It was a ceramic egg. And I was so taken with the way that the cast slip revealed my fingerprints and every piece of touch that I had, that I knew that mold making wasn't for me anymore, casting wasn't for me anymore, and that I needed to just build with my hands, of my hands, for my hands. And so this is when this work started to develop. If you think back to the iconography that I showed you at the beginning, the collage of elements that I showed you, I think of the hands, I think of my grandma, I think of gambling, and I also think of the soft carpets that would crawl up my grandmother's bathtub in her apartment in São Paulo. All that nostalgia and all of those memories were really starting to hit me. And so this was the first piece I made when I was learning how to tuft, using a tufting gun, and echoing or thinking about those feelings of nostalgia associated with the yarn and the softness, and then ceramic hand building, and that's in the show behind you too. Dados Mentirosos is the title, translated into Liar's Dice. You'll notice over the course of this presentation and throughout my work, I use both Portuguese and English titles. I'm not a native Portuguese speaker. I grew up in London, and that tension of me trying or putting an effort to speaking Portuguese is part of the labor of my work as well. It feels connected and important to me in my identity. But Dados Mentirosos, or Liar's Dice, is essentially a poker, but played with dice instead of cards. It involves lying and shouting and concealing the truth, and a lot of joy and kind of sneaky tactics to win. As kids, me and my cousins would sit on the carpeted floor of my grandma's living room and watch these adults play on this kind of sacred felted table where we would play all our games. Well, they would, because the kids weren't allowed to touch it. So remembering all of this, I wanted to bring the table down onto the ground, into the material that I remembered and recalled. I also wanted to think about my grandmother and my own hands, how my own hands are starting to reflect what were revealed in hers, how it makes me think about my own mortality, and the ways that I'm trying to slyly mask the truth in the same way that she did. This kind of thinking continued over the course of 2022, thinking again about biting my nails, thinking of my grandmother's lips as she kissed me and left this big imprint of lipstick on my cheek. Eu vou acender uma vela para você, I'll light a candle for you, starts to bring in the kind of Catholic iconography that I've been thinking about. This piece specifically addresses my mother's return to the Catholic Church after decades of being apart from it. Brazil being an incredibly Catholic country, and so that wrestle of a relationship always being present in my own life. In this, I think a lot about her gesture of lighting a candle for me, which she does every week now at church, and how I have to kind of negotiate with that internally, thinking about the generosity that she's providing me. You know, we're thousands and thousands of miles apart, she still lives in the United Kingdom, but also how it makes me tingle a little bit, or it makes the hair stand up on my spine, because the Catholic Church as a queer person is something that I've had to wrestle with and have ended up rejecting. And so that tension is always kind of present in the work that I make and the way that I think about my life. And so as I'm wrestling with that kind of like feeling of Catholic guilt or understanding of my relationship with Catholicism, I'm also coming to understand my own queer identity. How am I as a sexually liberated person? Who am I? Who do I love? And all of those things. In this piece, Come Unto Me, you start to see the fusion of those two elements. The kind of Orthodox cross that appears in this cabal of hands, but the gay nails that kind of trail out of them, and the sperm traveling down. Here too, the combination of elements of that queerness and Catholicism are combining. This hand is coming out literally of this Catholic arch. Is It Cold in the Water being a direct reference to the singer Sophie, who passed away a few years ago. And this piece, whose story I really love to tell, Except I'm Still Breathing, Aren't I? A lyric from Self-Esteem, a British musician. My vovó Lou, my grandma on my mother's side, would always come to London every summer when I was a kid, when she could still travel. While she was, in between telling us stories, reading us bedtime stories that I'll talk about later, every morning she would wake up and go outside onto the balcony and practice yoga. But instead of taking regular inhales and exhales, she would always have a cigarette in her hands. So she was always in like some weird frog pose, and every inhale would be this graceful puff of a cigarette, and the relaxed exhale would be this billowing plume of smoke. Every breath, I'm not even exaggerating here. It was so impressive. I don't know how she got oxygen in here. But it was also kind of the first time I was thinking about a more surreal depiction of the iconographies that I was thinking about. How do the hands attach to themselves? Where do the lips fit on the piece? How can the tufted elements be not just rugs, but actual body parts in the form of a tongue as a cigarette? But I also wanted to start thinking beyond the hand. All of these pieces that I showed you have the hand as a direct representation of itself. It's kind of a nail on the head moment. And so I started thinking about how I could represent touch as a feeling or emotion or an act or an emotion rather than as a direct representation of the hand. And so I was in Stoveworks at Tennessee on a residency in 2022, and the first piece that I had to make was Cheat on Me, this larger-than-life representation of the game Snakes and Ladders, which I think most Americans call Chutes and Ladders. But in the UK, we had the more kind of gruesome imagery of landing on snakes to travel down the board. As a child, I was a prolific cheater at board games. I was always the banker in Monopoly. I was always moving my pieces when my parents weren't looking. I was always stealing. I was always winning. And Snakes and Ladders in particular is associated directly with my parents' divorce. When they got divorced, my father found a new girlfriend a year or two later, Maya, who I love to bits. But I would always cheat, and I was always winning this game. And I think she always let me. I'm sure she knew, thinking back on it now. I was not that smart of a child. And I think we were both kind of pursuing the same objective, right? I wanted to win, I wanted to have control, which is something that I think is thematic across a lot of my work. And she was also this new person in my life and in our family. She wanted to make sure there was no drama. She wanted to be accepted and therefore loved. The same reference to touch appears in the grown-ups table too. I remember coming downstairs as a child after dinner parties my dad or my mom would hold, jealous of the fact that the 11-year-old in me was not allowed to participate in all the raucous activities that were happening downstairs, but really excited to project my own narrative onto everything when I encountered the work. And so I would walk downstairs and I would always find beautifully piled rinds of tangerines and really well-considered twisted metal sculptures from the tops of champagne bottles. And I'd always just kind of think and internalize all of these moments. In this piece, I'm thinking about what's left behind, what's held on to, what's touched, what's discarded, rather than just the physical presence of touch. The hand comes back in Wheel of Fortune, made also at Stoveworks. I held a workshop for 10 people where each participant was able to have their go at the tufting gun and create a slice of the pie, and then also create their own ceramic or clay hand that I then took back to Connecticut and fired and glazed myself. The idea for the Wheel of Fortune piece came after reading a stupid BuzzFeed article, but it referenced how the producers of Wheel of Fortune have assistants, physical assistants underneath the wheel, stopping it at the call from the producers above. And it made me think about the hubris that's required in the way that we think about the control we have over fate, destiny, chance, or luck. Thinking too about how I was separating the materials apart. A lot of the pieces that I was making at the time combined both elements, and it was starting to feel like a forced relationship. So this piece is a representation of the diagram that was drawn on my right abdomen when I had a piece of melanoma removed from my body about a year ago. The title comes from the fact that when the doctor finally removed the mole, she said, "Ooh, glad we caught it. It was 8 out of 10 melanoma." I would have really appreciated some better bedside manner, but I'm also grateful that I can now kind of lie and snuggle and rest with this piece rather than have this thing attacking my body. So too, I was allowing the ceramics to live their own lives along with the tufted rug elements. Initially, I had put these two pieces together, but as I was making them, they wanted to be pulled apart from each other. I do, in fact, find it really hard to talk about Fruit Loops. I haven't had the cereal since my grandmother died, and it's just one of those things that I find hard to reckon with. And so Toucan Sam is a figure that I can never really look at in the same way again. And then allowing the ceramics to live alone too. Oraquick is the brand of HIV tests that I take about every 6 months. As a queer person who doesn't have HIV, I really fundamentally believe in advancing the pursuit of scientific discoveries to cure or find better solutions to the disease. And so I participate in a lot of scientific studies associated with it. And so I'm always being sent these tests. It was the first time I allowed the glaze to kind of speak for me in the form of spit or semen. And it was also the first time I was really experimenting with both inanimate and animate objects coming together in a singular piece. And then I não faça isso, don't do that, which you see on the wall right in front of me. Probably the scariest and most difficult emotional piece that I've had to make, thinking about self-harm and mental illness. It was a piece where I ideated it in ceramics first, and as I slit into the arm and revealed the lips, I realized that it wanted something inside, so it would call the viewer in. It takes a little bit of discovery and a little bit of work to understand what's stuffed inside, and I think that relationship to time and movement is really important. And then I was also moving away from direct narrative. I've told you a lot of stories today already, and I wanted to make pieces that just allowed a viewer in without requiring maybe the knowledge of me in the most direct way. So right above you, I made Everything You Touch Has Been Touched before. For an exhibition in London, all about touch. It was made to be hugged, caressed, felt, or avoided in a time right after the pandemic was restrictions were being lifted in the UK. If you sneak a touch today, I won't judge you. And so I was also thinking about how I could think of my specific memories in a broader sense. How could I expand these narratives past a one and done piece of work? And so it started with Mum's bags. My mom always had a large collection of lovely handbags growing up, and after the divorce, she held on to them. I think to kind of hold her place in comfort, in control, and in status, to make it seem like everything was okay, even though we were struggling. I was not only a prolific cheater in board games as a kid, but I was a total kleptomaniac. And so I was always stealing from these bags. And I was buying Harry Potter DVDs and Crash Bandicoot video games. I think also to exercise that same sense of control over circumstances that I had no control over. We were using this icon and all of these objects for the same means and for the same end. So too, as I was making these bags and as I continue, I'm also thinking a lot about smoking. Not only am I a prolific nail biter, but I was a serial smoker as a teenager on a 10-a-day habit until I moved to the US in 2012. And ironically, the only way that I stop myself now from smoking is by making endless cigarettes. The feeling, the tactility, the way that the clay actually replicates a very similar reaction to being stubbed out are all things that sort of activate the same brain center as smoking a cigarette itself. And so I continue to explore those memories and our associations with cigarettes in a lot of my work through ceramics and textiles. And so we land ourselves here at Closed Switch. The continuation of Mum's bag, thinking more architecturally about the emotions that these bags can express. What does it mean that her hands are closed off? What does it mean that she might be reaching underneath? And this was the first bag that I made out of a single rug on the tufting frame. This is one piece then sewn and constructed together in an architectural way. A smoky gist continues the way that I think about both the lips and the cigarettes. I've evolved the lips from those sort of square representations into something that feels more natural and something that feels more like the kisses that I remember from my grandparents. The sun is a million times bigger than Earth, brings the hand back into ceramics in a more visceral way. The reds are redder, the scars are deeper, the marks are clearer. And the world and the sun are held in a light way that brings needle felting back into the picture from years ago as a new way to express myself through textiles. The title comes from my favorite fact in the Children's Illustrated Encyclopedia that my Vavalu would read to us in between her yoga sessions in London. And then Fumante Inveterrado, chain smoker, 72 of these handmade and butted out cigarettes displayed in the ceramic ashtray and left to kind of contemplate the feeling of touch left behind. And so we close a switch to open a pathway, and here's what my journey looks like next. I'm moving to Los Angeles, I'm leaving Connecticut, I'm ready to be in the West in a little bit more sunshine than I'm used to here. And I'm taking the iconographies that I've explored in ceramics and blowing them up in textiles. I have my studio set up there and I have a tufting frame. And so I've been allowed to kind of use and take up space in a way that feels a little more poppy, but also a little more nostalgic. Taking these really big, droopy cigarettes, these iconographies that I remember from British cigarette packs, and translating them in my own way. So thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the hands mean everything to me, and it took a lot of provocation from a lot of professors in this room and outside of it to just be like, hey, think about those, think about yourself, think about your vulnerabilities, right? Get yourself out of your head and into the creation.
Can you talk a little bit more about why the hands are usually depicted as like grotesque? Because you seem to speak about them pretty fondly.
Yeah, so there's definitely like a fondness to my nostalgia, but I'm also remembering the way that my grandma's hands scared me as she passed away, and how those scars are starting to reveal themselves on my own hands. How when I bite my nails, I often go too far and my cuticles start to bleed. And how I think hands are often the things that reveal that universal absolute. They're really hard to hide, and they're really hard to make up. Unless you're wearing gloves, it's almost impossible to not tell the truth through them. And so I find that there's a truth in making them incredibly grotesque, in revealing everything there is to reveal about them. I think it comforts me a little bit knowing that they'll never look quite that grotesque, and that's, okay and comfortable. Cool. Thank you.